de brass. Door handle was so cold it felt like touching a dead thing. Francis Picabia stood outside his cabin on the SS Lorraine, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and he could hear something strange coming from the upper deck. Drums, and underneath the drums, the soft slap of bare feet against wet wood. Was January 1913, and this wealthy French painter was about to see something that would change the entire direction of modern art. But he did not know that yet. All he knew was that his hands were shaking, and they had been shaking for months. Let me take you back to understand why this moment mattered so much. Francis Picabia was 33 years old, and on paper, he had everything. He came from money. His father was Cuban, his mother was French, and the family fortune meant he never had to worry about rent or food or any of the things that crushed other artists. He had a beautiful wife named Gabrielle, a brilliant woman who understood music and art and pushed him to take risks. Her talent that the Paris art world had recognized early. By his late 20s, galleries were fighting to show his impressionist landscapes. Critics called him gifted. Collectors wrote checks. And then he threw it all away. Around 1909, Picabia got bored with painting pretty pictures. He started experimenting with something new, something that made people uncomfortable. Abstract art. Paintings where you could not recognize anything. No trees, no rivers, no faces, just shapes and colors that were supposed to make you feel something without showing you anything real. The art world did not know what to do with this. The same galleries that once celebrated him now whispered that he had lost his mind. Sales disappeared. Critics who had praised him suddenly called his work incomprehensible. One reviewer said his paintings were a danger to art itself. Another called them a hoax, a conspiracy. By January 1913, Picabia was carrying 4 of these abstract paintings in the cargo hold of the SS Lorraine. He was sailing to New York City to show them at something called the Armory Show, the first major exhibition of modern European art in America. This was supposed to be his moment, his chance to prove that abstraction was not madness, but the future. But here is the thing nobody talks about. Picabia was terrified, not because he feared failure. He feared that maybe the critics were right. Maybe his paintings really were meaningless. He had spent years telling people that art should express inner feeling, that it should project emotion onto canvas without showing literal images. But late at night, alone in his cabin, he was not sure he believed his own speeches anymore. Code. He could explain what he was trying to do. He just could not feel it. His wife Gabrielle noticed. She watched him fill notebook after notebook with sketches, desperate scribbles that seemed to chase something he could not catch. She saw him drink more than usual. She heard him mutter in his sleep. The man she married was disappearing into his own theory, and the theory was eating him alive. Debt was the state of Francis Picabia when he heard those drums. He climbed the stairs to the first-class deck. The January wind cut through his coat and carried the smell of salt and engine grease and something else, something floral. Jasmine, maybe. The kind of perfume that cost more than most people earned in a week. A crowd had gathered near the railing. Well-dressed passengers in furs and top hats, standing stiff as fence posts, their faces caught somewhere between shock and fascination. Picabia pushed through to see what they were watching. And there she was, a woman dancing. Her name was Stasia Napierkowska. She was Polish, born in Paris, and at 21 years old she was already famous across Europe. She had started at the Folies Bergère, one of the most glamorous music halls in France, and caught the attention of directors who put her in silent films. By 1913, she had appeared in dozens of movies and performed for crowds that screamed her name. Now she was on this ship, sailing to New York to launch an American tour, and Shia was rehearsing her signature piece, a dance she called her Hindu dance, right there on the open deck with her troupe of performers. What Picabia saw made his throat tighten. Napierkowska danced barefoot. In 1913, that alone was scandalous. Respectable women did not show their feet in public. But she did more than show her feet. She moved like no one Picabia had ever seen. Her arms seemed to have no bones. Her spine curved and straightened like a wave. The drums pounded and she spun, her body tracing shapes in the air that looked almost like the shapes Picabia had been trying to paint. He could not look away. And he was not the only one. Standing at the railing, frozen in place, was a Dominican priest in full black robes. His hand gripped a rosary so tightly that the beads left marks in his palm. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. He stared at Napierkowska with the expression of a man watching his own damnation and choosing not to run. Picabia watched the priest watching the dancer, and something clicked. This was what he had been trying to paint. Not the dancer herself. Not her body, or her costume, or the technical movements of her limbs. He had been trying to paint this moment. The collision of desire and shame. The way beauty could stop a holy man in his tracks. The invisible force that held everyone on that deck captive, even though nothing was touching them. He had been painting abstraction because he thought that was the future. But he had never actually felt it. Not like this. Not with his pulse hammering and his mouth dry, and his hands finally still for the first time in months. The ship rolled on a wave. The deck tilted. Napierkowska adjusted her balance without missing a beat, her body responding to the motion of the ocean, as if she and the sea were having their own private conversation. Foes. The newspapers printed his quotes alongside headlines like, "Cubists and futurists are making insanity pay." The New York Times ran an editorial, calling this new art part of a general movement to disrupt and degrade society. They compared abstract painters to anarchists and called them destroyers who pretended to regenerate the world, while actually blocking the wheels of progress. Picabia read these reviews in his hotel room. His hands shook. His throat felt tight. He had come to America hoping to prove that abstraction was the future. Instead, he was watching abstraction become a punchline. But something else was happening too. Something the angry critics missed. The Armory Show was selling tickets like crazy. People lined up around the block to see the paintings they had been told to hate. They bought postcards of the Duchamp nude. They threw Cubist-themed dinner parties. They argued about art in restaurants and living rooms and subway cars. For the first time in American history, modern art was something ordinary people talked about. Picabia saw this and felt something complicated stir in his chest. The mockery hurt. But the attention meant something. People cared enough to be angry. That was better than being ignored. And then, near the end of the exhibition, Picabia made a decision that would change his life. He called a press conference. Journalists gathered, expecting more mystical nonsense about painting the soul. Instead, Picabia announced that he was breaking with the Cubists. He no longer belonged to any movement. He was not a Cubist, not a futurist, not an impressionist. He was something new. Something that did not have a name yet. The reporters scribbled furiously. This was a story. The French artist turning against his own people. The revolutionary declaring himself too revolutionary for the revolution. Gabrielle stood beside him, her hand cold on his sleeve. She had watched her husband struggle for years to find his place in the art world. Now he was publicly burning his last bridge. If the Cubists rejected him after this, he would have no tribe at all. No safety net. No one to defend him when the critics came for blood. Picabia did it anyway. He spoke the words and watched them ripple through the crowd. And for one strange moment, he felt free. That freedom lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Picabia opened the newspaper and found a small article buried in the back pages. The dancer from the ship, Stasia Napierkowska, had been arrested at the Palace Theatre in New York. Her performance had been declared indecent. Police had stopped the show, put her in handcuffs, and hauled her away for moving her body in ways that violated public morality. Picabia read the article 3 times. His coffee went cold. The hotel room seemed to shrink around him. The same city that was mocking his paintings for being incomprehensible had just arrested a woman for dancing. The same crowds that laughed at abstract art were calling for a performer to be punished because her movements made them uncomfortable. The connection hit him like a fist to the stomach. They arrest what they cannot frame. That phrase lodged in his brain and would not leave. The paintings in the armory were dangerous because they refused to be understood on traditional terms. The dancer on the ship was dangerous because she refused to move in traditional ways. Both were being punished for the same crime, being new, being different, being impossible to control. Picabia thought about that priest on the SS Lorraine, the holy man frozen at the railing, unable to look away from something his faith told him to reject. Vet priest. And these angry American critics were the same person. They want rules, they want boundaries. They want to know exactly where beauty ended and sin began. And when something came along that blurred those lines, they reached for handcuffs. Or mockery. Whatever weapon was closest. The Armory Show closed on March 15th. Over $300,000 worth of art had been sold. Tour. Edward Hopper, a young American painter nobody had heard of yet, made his very first sale. The exhibition moved on to Chicago and then Boston, where students burned effigies of modern art in the streets. Picabia sailed back to France, carrying something heavier than luggage. He carried the memory of what he had seen on the ship and what he had witnessed in New York, a dancer being led away in handcuffs. A country terrified of things it could not explain. And somewhere inside himself, a question that would not stop burning. What if the abstraction he had been painting was never really abstract at all? What if it had always been about this? The clash between freedom and control. Thor. The way society punishes what it cannot understand. The moment when beauty becomes so powerful that it looks like a crime. He did not have answers yet. But he had something better. He had a vision that was starting to take shape. And back in Paris, a massive white canvas was waiting for him to figure out what it meant. The Armory Show was over. The dancer was released and sent home in disgrace. The critics declared victory over the forces of chaos and insanity. But Francis Picabia knew something they did not. The real work had not even started yet. Nen. She looked up, straight at Picabia. Their eyes met for maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. His sketchbook slipped from his fingers. The wind caught the pages and scattered them across the wet deck like dying birds. He did not reach for them. He could not move. Gabrielle found him later, still standing at the railing, the rehearsal long over, the deck empty except for the salt spray and the fading smell of jasmine. She asked, what was wrong? He could not explain. How do you tell your wife that you just realized your entire career has been a performance? That you have been pretending to feel things you did not feel? That a dancer on a ship just showed you what real abstraction looks like, and it has nothing to do with theory or manifestos or the approval of Paris critics. VHF. The ship would reach New York Harbor in 32 hours. The Armory Show would open in 3 weeks. And Francis Picabia had no idea that what he saw on that deck would lead to a painting that still hangs in one of the greatest museums in the world. But before any of that could happen, something terrible was about to occur. Something that would connect the dancer and the painter in a way neither of them expected. Something that would prove that America was not ready for revolution, whether it came in the form of a brush or a bare foot. The SS Lorraine pushed on through the dark Atlantic, carrying its cargo of abstract paintings and scandalous dancers toward a city that was about to be shocked by both. The priest. He stayed at that railing until midnight, his rosary beads cutting deeper into his flesh, watching the spot where she had danced long after she had gone. 70,000 people walked through the doors of the 69th Regiment Armory in New York City during February and March of 1913. Most of them left angry, some left confused, a few left changed forever. And Francis Picabia stood in the middle of it all, watching America lose its mind over paintings it could not understand. The Armory Show was supposed to be a celebration. The first major exhibition of modern European art on American soil. Over 1,300 paintings, sculptures, and drawings packed into a building normally used to store weapons and train soldiers. The organizers had decorated the halls with pine branches and yellow streamers, trying to make the space feel festive. But nothing could soften what was about to happen. America in 1913 was not ready for this. Let me paint you a picture of what the average visitor saw when they walked in. The first galleries were fine. Impressionist landscapes. Portraits that looked like portraits. Art that made sense. People nodded politely and moved on. Then they reached the back rooms, and everything fell apart. Cubist paintings hung on the walls like puzzles that refused to be solved. Faces broken into geometric shards, bodies fragmented into angles that hurt to look at. Colors that clashed on purpose. The visitors stopped nodding. They started pointing. They started laughing, and then they started getting angry. One painting became the lightning rod for all that rage. Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. Nobody could see the nude. Nobody could see the staircase. All they saw was brown chaos. The newspapers had a field day. One critic called it an explosion in a shingle factory day. Another said it looked like a staircase descending a nude, flipping the title into a joke. Cartoonists drew parodies. Poets wrote mocking verses. Former President Theodore Roosevelt visited the exhibition, stared at the Duchamp, and compared it to a Navajo rug he had in his bathroom. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos stood Francis Picabia, trying to explain why any of it mattered. He had 4 paintings in the show, abstract works, with names like dancers at the Spring Procession in Seville. Swirling colors that did not represent anything you could point at and name. The same kind of work that had gotten him rejected by Paris galleries. The same kind of work he was no longer sure he believed in himself. But the American journalists did not know about his doubts. They saw a wealthy French artist with confident opinions and exotic theories. They crowded around him with notebooks and demanded explanations. Why did he paint this way? What did it mean? Was this all some kind of elaborate joke? Picabia told them he painted his soul on canvas. He said his art was not meant to be a photographic memory of visual sensation. It was meant to express the purest abstract reality of form and color considered in themselves. He used words like subjective and emotional and mental states, too. He sounded like a prophet describing a new religion. The canvas was 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide, pure white, empty. And Francis Picabia had been staring at it for 6 hours without making a single mark. It was summer 1913. Paris was hot and sticky, and the air in his studio on Boulevard des Batignolles smelled like turpentine and stale coffee and failure. States outside. The city moved on without him. Horse carriages rattled past. Street vendors shouted. Life continued as if nothing had happened in New York, as if the Armory Show had never existed. As if a dancer had never been dragged away in handcuffs for moving her body in ways America could not accept. But inside this studio, time had stopped, and Francis Picabia was falling apart. Let me tell you what rock bottom looks like for a man who has everything. Picabia had returned from New York famous. Or infamous. The newspapers had printed his name alongside words like revolutionary and madman and fraud. He had stood in front of crowds and declared that he painted his soul on canvas. He had broken publicly with the Cubists and announced that he belonged to no movement, that he was something entirely new. None of it meant anything. The French critics did not care about his American adventure. To them, he was still the rich playboy who abandoned Impressionism for incomprehensible nonsense. The same galleries that had rejected him before he left still rejected him now. His old collectors had moved on. His new ideas had not opened any doors in Paris. If anything, his fame in New York made things worse, too. The French art world saw him as a sellout, a man who performed for Americans because his own countrymen knew better. His marriage was cracking. Gabrielle had supported him through every strange turn, every abandoned style, every midnight argument about the meaning of art. She had 4 children to raise, and a husband who locked himself in his studio for days at a time, emerging only to drink wine and pick fights about theories nobody understood. Her patience, which had once seemed infinite, was wearing thin as paper. And the worst part, Picabia could not blame her.
He stood in front of that massive white canvas and saw himself clearly for the first time in years. Not the confident revolutionary he pretended to be. Not the wealthy genius who could afford to take risks. Just a 34-year-old man who had been running from one style to another his entire career, never staying long enough to discover if he actually believed in any of it. Impressionism had been easy. Paint what you see. Make it pretty. Sell it to rich people who want something nice above their fireplace. He had been good at that, too good. So good that it bored him to death. Then came the experiments. Neo-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, each one a new costume he tried on, wore for a season, then tossed aside when something shinier came along. Critics had called him restless. They meant it as an insult, but they were right. He could not sit still. He could not commit. He was always chasing the next revolution because standing still meant facing himself. And now, standing still in front of this empty canvas, he had nowhere left to run. He thought about Napierkowska. She was back in France by now. The American newspapers had reported her arrest, her brief detention, her release. She had sailed home bitter and angry, telling reporters that Americans were narrow-minded people who could not understand beauty. The tour that was supposed to launch her international career had ended in humiliation. But Picabia could not stop thinking about what he had seen on that ship. The way she moved, the way the priest could not look away. The way his own hands had finally stopped shaking for those few minutes while he watched her dance. That was real. Whatever he had felt on that deck was not a theory or a manifesto or a clever explanation for journalists. It was something in his chest, something in his blood. Something that had nothing to do with being modern or revolutionary or ahead of his time. He had spent years painting abstraction because he thought that was the future. But he had never actually felt abstract, not really. He had been performing abstraction the same way he had performed Impressionism before it, wearing a costume, playing a role, waiting for applause. The dancer had shown him what real abstraction looked like, not the absence of images. The presence of feelings so powerful that images could not contain it. And here was the terrible truth that made his stomach turn. He did not know how to paint that. Everything he had learned, every technique he had mastered, every style he had copied and abandoned, none of it had prepared him for this moment. He knew how to paint a landscape. He knew how to fragment a figure into geometric shapes. He knew how to explain his work to critics in ways that sounded intelligent and important. But he did not know how to paint the feeling of watching Forbidden's grace. He did not know how to put on canvas the collision of desire and shame that had frozen a holy man at a ship's railing. He did not know how to capture the smell of jasmine and engine grease and salt wine all mixed together into something that felt like the end of the world and the beginning of something new. The canvas stayed white. Days passed, then weeks. Gabriel stopped asking how the work was going. His children learned to tiptoe past the studio door. The summer heat turned the room into a furnace, and still Picabia stood there, brush in hand, unable to make a mark. He started drinking more, sleeping less. He would stay awake until 3 in the morning staring at that white expanse, then collapse for a few hours and wake up with the same emptiness staring back at him. And then, one night, something broke. He was alone in the studio. The house was quiet. A single lamp burned in the corner. The canvas loomed like a ghost. And Picabia finally admitted something he had been hiding from everyone, including himself. His entire career of abstraction had been a lie, not a deliberate lie. Not a con job designed to trick collectors, something worse. A lie he had told himself because the truth was too frightening. He had never believed in painting the invisible. He had been afraid to paint what actually moved him. The dancer on that ship was not abstract. She was devastatingly specific, her bare feet, her liquid spine. The exact angle of her arms when she spun. The way the priest's knuckles turned white around his rosary beads. The smell of perfume cutting through the ocean air. These were not vague feelings. They were precise moments burned into his memory. And every attempt to reduce them to theory, to explain them as emotional states projected on canvas, had been a way of avoiding the real work. The real work was this: to paint something so specific that it became universal. To show a moment so precise that anyone who saw it would feel what he felt, not because he had explained it to them. Because the painting itself would carry the feeling the way a ship carries passengers across an ocean. He picked up a brush, dipped it in paint, and for the first time in months, his hand did not shake. The canvas was no longer his enemy. It was a door. And on the other side was something that did not have a name, yet something that would take months of brutal work to bring into the world, something that would change the way people thought about what art could do. But that is the story of how the painting got made. And that story belongs to the next chapter. What matters now is this. In the darkest moment of his life, standing in a sweltering studio in Paris while his marriage crumbled and his reputation burned, Francis Picabia finally stopped running. He had been lying to himself for years, and the lie had almost destroyed him. But on that night, in front of that empty canvas, he found something stronger than the lie. He found the memory of a woman dancing on the deck of a ship, And he decided that memory deserved to live forever, even if it killed him to make it happen. The first brushstroke was green, not a pretty green. Not the green of spring leaves or rolling hills. A green that looked almost sick, almost alive. The kind of green you see in the ocean when a storm is coming. Francis Picabia pressed the brush against the canvas and dragged it downward. Paint smeared across white, and something in his chest unclenched for the first time in months. It was late summer 1913. The breakthrough had come, and now the real torture began.
See, having a vision is one thing. Making that vision real is something else entirely. Picabia knew what he wanted to paint. He could feel it in his bones. The dancer on the ship, the priest at the railing. The collision of beauty and shame and desire and the endless rolling of the Atlantic beneath them all. But turning that feeling into paint on canvas was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. He worked like a man possessed. Gabrielle later described it in terms that still give me chills. She said he painted with a feverish, unimaginable rapidity, night and day. Without eating, without sleeping, without stopping to explain himself or ask for approval or wonder if he was doing it right. The studio became a battlefield. Paint everywhere. Empty wine bottles, lined up like soldiers. Sketches pinned to every wall, covering the windows, blocking out the light. He did not want light. He wanted to see what was inside his head, and daylight only got in the way. The canvas was enormous. Nearly 10 feet by 10 feet. He had to use a ladder to reach the top. His arms ached. His back screamed. Paint splattered his clothes, his face, his hair. He stopped shaving. Stopped bathing. Stopped being a husband or a father or anything except a man trying to pull something impossible out of thin air. And slowly, day by day, the painting began to emerge. He started with shapes, not recognizable shapes, not arms or legs or faces. Forms that curved and spiraled like the memory of motion. He layered greens over blues, blues over ochres, ochres over metallic silvers that caught the lamplight and seemed to move when you looked at them from different angles. The colors were not random. Every choice came from that night on the ship. The green of the Atlantic in winter. The blue of the sky just before dawn. The ochre of brass railings and the silver of moonlight on wet wood. He was not painting what he saw. He was painting what he remembered feeling when he saw it. This is the part most people do not understand about abstract art. They think it is random. They think the artist just throws paint at a canvas and calls it deep. But Picabia was doing the opposite of random. Every single mark on that canvas corresponded to something specific. The curve of Napierkowska's spine when she spun. The angle of the priest's shoulders as he gripped the railing. The way the ship tilted on a wave and everyone on deck adjusted their balance without thinking. He was painting rhythm. The rhythm of the drums. The rhythm of the ocean. The rhythm of a heartbeat watching something it should not want to watch. Weeks passed, the painting grew, and Picabia realized he was not making one painting. He was making two. The first would be called Udnie. The name was mysterious on purpose. Some people think it was an anagram for Jean Dudin, a French music theorist who believed that rhythm connected all the arts. Others think it was just a sound Picabia liked after too many sleepless nights. Either way, the subtitle made the meaning clear. Young American Girl, Dance, Faye. The second painting would be called Ed Alasil, another strange word. But this one Picabia built himself by alternating the letters of two French words. Well meaning star, and danse meaning dance. Star dancer. The title was a code, and the code pointed straight at Napierkowska, but the subtitle of the second painting revealed something else. Ecclesiastic, the priest. Picabia was not just painting the dancer, who was painting the man who watched her, the holy man, caught between his vows and his desires. The figure frozen at the railing, rosary cutting into his palm, unable to look away from something his faith told him to reject. Both paintings were about the same moment, but they were opposite sides of the same coin. Udnie was about movement, freedom, the joy of a body doing exactly what it was made to do. Atanisal was about stillness, paralysis, the agony of wanting something you cannot have. Together, they told the whole story of that night on the Atlantic. The dancer and the priest, the motion and the frozen witness, the beauty and the shame. By October, both canvases were nearly finished. Picabia stepped back and looked at what he had made. The paintings were unlike anything he had ever created, unlike anything anyone had ever created. They did not look like Cubism or Futurism or any of the movements he had flirted with before. They looked like memories turned inside out. Colors spiraled from the center of each canvas like whirlpools. Shapes overlapped and merged and separated again. There was no clear image to hold on to, no figure you could point at and say that is a person or that is a ship. But somehow, standing in front of them, you felt motion. You felt the rocking of the ocean. You felt the pulse of drums and the heat of watching something forbidden. Picabia submitted both paintings to the Salon d'Automne, the most important art exhibition in Paris. The show would open in November. Hundreds of artists would display their work. Thousands of visitors would stream through the galleries. And for the first time in his life, Picabia did not care what the critics would say. He'd painted something true. Not true to nature. Not true to theory. True to himself. True to a memory that had been burning in his chest for almost a year. November arrived. The Salon d'Automne opened its doors. Picabia's paintings were hung in a staircase landing. Not the main gallery. A staircase. Some people saw this as an insult. The organizers shoving his strange work into a corner where serious visitors might miss it. But Picabia understood something the organizers did not. The staircase was perfect. It meant viewers would approach the paintings from different heights and angles. Walking up, you saw them one way. Walking down, you saw them another. The paintings changed depending on where you stood, just like a memory changes every time you revisit it. Opening night. The crowd gathered. Critics with notebooks, collectors with checkbooks, journalists looking for scandal. The entire Paris art world packed into the Grand Palais, ready to judge. Picabia stood near his paintings and watched the reactions. Most people laughed. They called the work devoid of sense. They said it looked like someone had spilled paint and called it genius. The same insults he had heard 100 times before. But one man did not laugh. Gigamop, the poet. The champion of Cubism, the most influential voice in the French avant-garde, he stood in front of Udnie for a long time, saying nothing. Then he turned to the crowd and spoke 2 words that would echo through art history. Ardent and lyrical. That was all. Ardent and lyrical. But coming from Apollinaire, those words meant everything. They meant that someone understood. That the painting was not nonsense. That the rhythm and color and spiraling motion added up to something real. The critics kept laughing. The collectors kept walking past. But Picabia did not care anymore. One person had seen it. One person had felt what he felt on that ship almost a year ago. And somewhere in France, a dancer who had been arrested for moving her body too freely had no idea that her midnight rehearsal on the deck of the SS Lorraine was now hanging in the most important art show in Paris. The painting was finished. The showing had happened. But the story was not over, because what Picabia did not know yet was that Udnie would outlive him. It would outlive the critics who mocked it. It would outlive the First World War that was about to tear Europe apart. It would hang in museums for over a century, and people would stand in front of it and feel something they could not explain, just like he felt that night on the ship. Just like the priest felt, frozen at the railing, watching a woman dance in ways that broke every rule he had sworn to obey. The painting was done, but its real life was just beginning. The brass door handles of the SS Lorraine were melted down for bullets in 1917. The ship itself was decommissioned, stripped for parts, and sold for scrap. The Atlantic Ocean kept rolling as if nothing had ever danced across its surface. And the priest who stood frozen at that railing on a January night in 1913. History does not remember his name. He walked away from that deck and vanished into the anonymous millions who lived and died without anyone writing down their story. But the painting survived. Let me tell you what happened to everyone in this story. Because the ending is not what you might expect. Stasia Napierkowska, the dancer who started it all, returned to France angry and bitter. She told reporters that Americans were narrow-minded people, utterly impervious to any beautiful impression. Her dream of international stardom had ended with handcuffs and humiliation. She went back to making silent films in Europe, appearing in over 80 movies before the talkies came and swept her generation away. She died in Paris in May 1945, just as World War II was ending. She was 53 years old. Most obituaries did not mention the arrest in New York. None of them mentioned that a painter on a ship had watched her dance and turned that memory into one of the most important abstract paintings ever made. She never knew, or if she knew, she never said. Francis Picabia kept running. That was always his way. After the Salon d'Automne, after the critics laughed and Apollinaire called his work ardent and lyrical, Picabia moved on to the next thing. He helped found the Dada movement, the anti-art rebellion that mocked everything serious people believed about culture. He published magazines filled with nonsense and manifestos. He declared that the only way to be followed is to run faster than the others. His marriage to Gabrielle ended in 1930, after 21 years and 4 children. She went on to join the French resistance during World War II, hiding Allied soldiers and smuggling documents for the Belgian Secret Service. She lived to be 104 years old, one of the most quoted witnesses of the entire avant-garde movement. And yet most history books only mention her as Picabia's first wife. Picabia himself bounced between women and styles with equal restlessness. He abandoned Dada, the same way he abandoned Impressionism and Cubism before it. He painted nudes and machines and transparent overlapping figures. He made enemies of his former friends and friends of his former enemies. He spent money like water and somehow never ran out. He died in November 1953, in the same house in Paris where he had been born 74 years earlier. The man who spent his whole life running ended up exactly where he started. But Udnie did not stay still. The painting traveled. It hung in galleries and museums across Europe. Art historians wrote papers about it. Students stood in front of it trying to understand what they were seeing. Some called it a masterpiece. Others called it a fraud. The argument never stopped, which is exactly what Picabia would have wanted. In 1948, the French government purchased Udnie for the national collection. The painting that critics had called devoid of sense was now considered important enough to belong to the people of France. It moved to the Centro Pompidou in Paris, one of the most famous modern art museums in the world, and that is where it hangs today. If you go to Paris, you can see it, nearly 10 feet tall, nearly 10 feet wide. Greens and blues and ochres spiraling outward from the center like a memory trying to escape the skull that contains it. There is no dancer in the painting, no ship, no priest, no Atlantic Ocean, just color and motion and rhythm frozen in time. And yet, people stand in front of it and feel something. They cannot always say what. They cannot point to a figure and explain the story the way you can with a traditional painting. But something in those spiraling shapes reaches into their chest and squeezes. The same way something squeezed Picabia's chest when he watched Napierkowska spin on that wet deck over a century ago.